The alarming warning from USDA leadership. Today's update brings an urgent and deeply concerning message for millions of Americans who rely on SNAP benefits. According to new statements from U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins, the federal government is now actively considering a cutoff of SNAP funding to certain states, an action that could immediately affect families, seniors, low-income workers, and vulnerable households across the country. This is not speculation. This is a direct warning from the highest level of USDA leadership, and it signals a major shift in how the government plans to administer and monitor the SNAP program going forward. Secretary Rollins explains that this potential cutoff stems from what the administration believes is widespread noncompliance among multiple states, specifically states that have refused to turn over complete SNAP data requested earlier this year. In her message, she emphasizes that accurate data is essential to identifying fraud, determining true need, and ensuring taxpayers' money is being used responsibly. According to her, without full cooperation from every state, the USDA cannot effectively evaluate how SNAP funds are being distributed or whether the system is being misused. This growing dispute isn't just administrative or political. It has very real consequences for millions of people. If the federal funding is paused even for a short time, many households may not receive their monthly SNAP allotment. Food budgets would immediately tighten, food banks would come under tremendous strain, and countless families could face sudden uncertainty about how to cover basic grocery needs. Seniors living on fixed incomes, parents juggling multiple jobs, disabled adults, and individuals still recovering financially after difficult years would all be among the most vulnerable. The warning comes at a time when many Americans are still navigating inflation, rising food costs, and unstable employment conditions. For communities that depend on SNAP to supplement their monthly budget, even a temporary delay, or worse, a complete cutoff, could push them into severe hardship. As we begin to break down this developing situation, we'll explore why the federal government issued this unprecedented demand, how states have responded, and what this could mean for households nationwide as early as the next benefits cycle. This is only the beginning of the story. In the next part, we'll examine the new federal work requirement rules that took effect on December 1st and why they play a major role in this growing conflict. New work requirements that took effect nationwide. A major source of tension behind the SNAP issue is the set of new federal work requirements that officially took effect on December 1st. These rules are not minor adjustments. They represent one of the most significant shifts to the SNAP program in more than a decade. Under the updated policy, millions of SNAP recipients across the country must now meet new community engagement expectations in order to continue receiving benefits. These expectations include working, volunteering, or participating in a job training program for at least 80 hours per month. For many Americans, especially those already juggling unpredictable schedules, childcare challenges, or transportation barriers, this requirement introduces a serious new burden. While some supporters argue that the rule encourages economic self-sufficiency, others warn that it may unfairly penalize people whose circumstances make consistent participation difficult. The requirement applies even more broadly than before, affecting adults aged 55 to 64, a group that often faces age-related job discrimination, health limitations, and difficulty re-entering the workforce. Another major change is the elimination of previous exemptions for several vulnerable groups, including many homeless individuals, veterans, and young adults aging out of the foster care system. These changes have raised concerns among social service advocates who fear that people who genuinely need assistance will lose access simply because they cannot meet rigid new standards. The sense of urgency grows even more when we consider the penalty for non-compliance. Under the revised rules, individuals who do not meet the 80-hour monthly requirement can only receive SNAP benefits for 3 months within a 3-year period. That means that missing the requirement, whether due to illness, job loss, family emergency, or unpredictable scheduling, could create long-term consequences lasting years. Federal officials argue that these requirements are long overdue, pointing to the belief that too many people have stayed on SNAP even after their financial situation improved. Critics counter that the job market, especially for older workers and low-income households, still presents major obstacles that cannot be fixed simply by mandating work hours. Meanwhile, food prices remain high, wages in some sectors are stagnant, and many households live paycheck to paycheck, conditions that make SNAP a critical lifeline rather than an optional supplement. As these new rules begin rolling out, states are now responsible for verifying compliance, tracking participation, and reporting data back to the federal government. And this is where the conflict intensifies. States that do not fully cooperate with federal reporting requirements may soon see their SNAP funding withheld entirely. Rising fraud concerns and the push for accountability. Another major element driving the federal crackdown is the administration's claim that SNAP spending has grown far beyond what is justified by true economic need. According to Secretary Rollins and the data review teams working with the USDA, nearly $100 billion in SNAP expenditures have been examined over recent months. During this process, officials say they have identified thousands of cases of improper or illegal use of EBT cards, ranging from individuals selling benefits for cash to households misreporting income levels. While fraud represents a relatively small percentage of overall spending, federal leadership argues that even a small percentage of a program this large results in billions of dollars lost each year. They insist that the taxpayers deserve transparency and accountability, and that the only way to achieve this is for every state to provide complete, up-to-date participation data. Part of the administration's motivation stems from what they describe as SNAP expansion without proper oversight during the Biden presidency. They acknowledge that the program grew rapidly during the pandemic, which was expected, but they argue that what came afterward raised serious questions. Specifically, they claim that many of the temporary policies designed for emergency conditions never scaled back even as the economy reopened. In their view, this created an environment where some people received maximum benefits long after their financial situations improved. The administration also highlights a broader cultural issue, saying that some individuals have come to rely on enhanced government programs as a permanent source of income rather than a temporary safety net. To illustrate their point, they reference past stimulus measures, such as the $600 per week enhanced unemployment benefits, which were later phased out once economic conditions stabilized. They argue that SNAP should undergo a similar weaning process, gradually reducing benefits for people who no longer qualify under stricter income guidelines. This argument, however, is not without controversy. Critics point out that many Americans still face higher living costs, unstable income, and limited job opportunities. They argue that cutting benefits without first ensuring realistic pathways to employment will push vulnerable households deeper into hardship. Food banks across the country have already reported increased demand, and social service workers warn that additional cuts could overwhelm local support systems. Yet the administration maintains that despite these concerns, a line must be drawn. They state that the program cannot continue expanding unchecked and that states must participate fully in the accountability process. According to Secretary Rollins, nearly 700,000 people have already been removed from SNAP after the initial audits, a number the administration sees as proof that oversight works. As tension grows, the refusal of certain states to provide data has become the central trigger for potential funding cuts. Federal officials argue that without this information, they cannot determine who genuinely needs assistance and who does not. The states refusing to comply and the growing federal showdown. At the center of this escalating crisis is a group of 21 states, primarily blue states, that have refused to provide the USDA with detailed SNAP data requested earlier this year. According to Secretary Rollins, this marks the first time in history that all states were required to submit comprehensive program data for federal review. While 29 red states complied, the remaining states have either delayed, resisted, or outright declined to hand over the information. Among the most notable non-compliant states are California, New York, and Minnesota, three of the largest SNAP jurisdictions in the country. Combined, these states serve millions of recipients and account for a significant portion of national SNAP spending. Their refusal to comply has triggered not only frustration at the federal level, but also the threat of an unprecedented funding halt. State officials argue that the federal request is overly broad, invasive, or inconsistent with state privacy policies. Some insist that the USDA is attempting to centralize data access in a way that oversteps traditional boundaries between state-administered and federally funded programs. Others simply claim that the timeline for submission was unrealistic or that the request creates administrative burdens that require additional funding to implement. But the USDA rejects these explanations. Secretary Rollins has stated publicly that compliance is not optional and that refusing to provide data raises suspicions about potential mismanagement or misuse of federal funds. She insists that the federal government must confirm whether the money is reaching the right households and whether certain groups are being overpaid, underpaid, or improperly approved. The consequences for noncompliance are immediate and severe. Secretary Rollins has confirmed that the federal government is prepared to stop transferring SNAP funds to these states as early as next week if they continue withholding the required data. The USDA has the authority to withhold administrative and benefit funding until states comply, meaning SNAP programs in those regions could suddenly run out of money to issue monthly benefits. This is not just a bureaucratic conflict, it is a direct threat to the financial stability and food security of millions of households. If federal funding stops, states will have two options. Use state funds to cover SNAP benefits, which could cost billions they are not prepared to spend, or allow benefits to lapse, leaving families, seniors, and disabled individuals without the support they rely on. Early reports indicate that while some states may attempt legal challenges, others are scrambling to determine whether they can temporarily fund the program themselves. But for many states, covering even 1 month of SNAP benefits would require emergency legislative action and significant budget reshuffling, neither of which can be accomplished overnight. This standoff places millions of Americans in uncertainty. Many could see disruptions as early as December, but nearly all recipients in non-compliant states are at high risk of losing benefits entirely by January unless their state either submits the required data or finds temporary funding solutions. The immediate consequences for households if funding stops. If federal SNAP funding is paused, the impact on households in non-compliant states will be swift, severe, and unavoidable. According to the USDA's current position, once the federal government halts transfers, states will no longer receive the money needed to load monthly SNAP benefits onto EBT cards. This means that for millions of people, the support they rely on to purchase groceries could simply fail to appear when their card is supposed to reload. The earliest wave of disruptions could occur as soon as the upcoming benefit cycle, especially for individuals who receive SNAP early in the month. While some states might have a small reserve of administrative funds, those reserves are not nearly large enough to cover even a fraction of the monthly benefits that millions depend on. SNAP is one of the most expensive social programs to administer at the state level, and the vast majority of funding, up to 100% in some states, comes from the federal government. Families living paycheck to paycheck would feel the shock almost immediately. With food inflation still high and grocery prices showing no sign of easing, even a 1 month interruption could push many households into emergency mode. Seniors and disabled adults receiving fixed incomes would struggle the most, as their budgets allow for little flexibility. Parents who rely on SNAP to feed children may find themselves suddenly and unexpectedly unable to provide full meals. In previous national SNAP disruptions, food banks across the country saw massive surges in demand, and this time would be no different. But food banks today are already stretched thin. Many are dealing with shortages of volunteers, reduced donations, and rising food costs themselves. If SNAP is halted for millions, these charitable organizations simply will not be able to absorb the overflow. In many areas, shelves would empty quickly, leaving even fewer options for families in need. Households may attempt to rely on emergency savings, but for most low-income families, such savings are minimal or non-existent. Research shows that a significant percentage of SNAP recipients have less than $500 in liquid savings, meaning they cannot withstand sudden financial shocks. Some may attempt to cut other essentials, utilities, medications, transportation, but these sacrifices come with their own risks. Children in affected households may also face food insecurity during school breaks or weekends when school meal programs are not available. Seniors who rely on SNAP for dietary needs, especially those with diabetes, heart disease, or mobility limitations, could see declines in health if they are forced to switch to cheaper but less nutritious food options. If states attempt to take on the cost of SNAP temporarily, the financial burden would be enormous. Even a mid-sized state could spend hundreds of millions of dollars per month to maintain current benefit levels. For many governors and legislatures, especially those already juggling budget deficits, such spending would be unsustainable. And perhaps the most unsettling part, if the standoff continues and states do not submit the requested data, Secretary Rollins has warned that no federal SNAP funds will be issued to these states for January. That would not just be a temporary delay, it would be a systemic, statewide shutdown of food assistance. A legal battle on the horizon, lawsuits, court orders, and federal power. As the conflict between the federal government and the non-compliant states intensifies, many legal experts believe a major court battle is now inevitable. When federal funding tied to essential benefits is threatened, states almost always respond with legal action, and this situation is likely no different. Several governors and attorney generals have already signaled that they are prepared to challenge the USDA's authority to withhold funds, arguing that the federal demands may exceed what is legally permissible under existing SNAP statutes. At the center of the upcoming legal debate is a simple yet powerful question. Does the federal government have the right to suspend SNAP payments if states do not hand over detailed beneficiary data? According to Secretary Rollins, the answer is absolutely yes. She states that SNAP is a federally funded program and therefore states must comply with federal oversight requirements. Her position is that if federal dollars are being distributed, federal officials must have access to the data necessary to evaluate fraud, verify eligibility, and ensure taxpayer dollars are being used appropriately. However, state leaders opposing the mandate argue that federal agencies cannot impose new data sharing requirements without going through a formal rulemaking process. Some assert that the USDA's demands may conflict with state privacy laws or exceed the scope of what Congress has authorized. Others argue that withholding benefits punishes residents rather than state administrators, a point that courts sometimes view sympathetically, especially when essential needs like food security are at stake. If lawsuits are filed, the first stop would likely be lower federal courts, where judges could issue temporary injunctions to pause the USDA's actions. If an injunction is granted, SNAP payments could continue while the legal battle plays out, potentially preventing immediate benefit loss for millions of people. But injunctions are not guaranteed. Courts may rule that the federal government's oversight authority is clear and essential, especially when allegations of widespread fraud or mismanagement are involved. If that happens, the USDA would retain the right to withhold funds, placing states under enormous pressure to comply quickly. Should the dispute escalate further, the case could ultimately reach the U.S. Supreme Court. In recent years, the court has heard multiple cases involving federal agency authority, states' rights, and government benefit programs. Depending on the court's interpretation, this case could set a major national precedent, either strengthening federal oversight or limiting how much power agencies have over state-run social programs. Meanwhile, millions of Americans remain caught in the middle of this political and legal tug-of-war. For them, the legal nuances make little difference. They care about one thing: whether they will have the funds to buy groceries next month. And unless the courts intervene quickly or the states submit the required data, that answer remains uncertain. Even if lawsuits are filed, the legal process cannot guarantee immediate relief. Some decisions could take weeks, others months. And during that time, states may still face the possibility of missing federal transfers, creating financial strain and uncertainty across entire communities. The wider impact on communities, food banks, and local economies. If SNAP funding is halted for millions of recipients at the same time, the effects will ripple far beyond individual households. This would not be an isolated financial hardship. It would be a shockwave hitting entire communities, local food systems, and state economies. SNAP is one of the largest and most influential federal assistance programs, and when its benefits are interrupted, nearly every aspect of community life feels the strain. Food banks would be among the first to experience overwhelming demand. Many of them already report operating at or near capacity due to rising food prices and increased need during recent years. If even a fraction of SNAP recipients lose access to monthly benefits, food banks will face shortages almost immediately. Volunteers cannot instantly multiply. Donations cannot magically increase overnight. Warehouse shelves that used to hold boxes of canned goods and fresh produce would empty at unprecedented speed, leaving thousands of families with nowhere else to turn. Local grocery stores would also feel the impact. SNAP benefits are spent directly in the community, often at small, family-owned markets or neighborhood stores that rely on consistent sales volumes. When millions lose benefits, these stores see sudden declines in revenue. That drop forces them to reduce inventory, limit staff hours, or even close, especially in rural areas or low-income urban neighborhoods where profit margins are already thin. This creates food deserts, making it even more difficult for struggling families to access affordable groceries. The effects extend to state and local economies as well. Economists estimate that every dollar of SNAP benefits generates up to $1.50 in economic activity as families spend money on food that supports grocery workers, truck drivers, farmers, and countless others across the supply chain. Removing hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in monthly SNAP spending would shrink local economic activity in ways that could take years to fully recover from. Children face unique and long-term risks when SNAP disappears. Food insecurity can hinder cognitive development, weaken immune systems, and lower academic performance. Many kids rely on SNAP to fill the gap when school cafeterias are closed or when family budgets fall short. Without these benefits, households may be forced to stretch meals, reduce nutrition quality, or skip meals entirely, all of which can have serious developmental consequences. For seniors, the dangers are even more immediate. Older adults with diabetes, heart disease, or mobility limitations often depend on SNAP to purchase the specific foods their health requires. Without benefits, they may resort to cheaper, unhealthy options that worsen their conditions, leading to higher medical costs and hospitalizations. Some seniors may even choose between medication and food, a heartbreaking decision that health advocates see far too often. Communities also experience increased strain on shelters, emergency services, and nonprofit organizations when food insecurity rises. Local governments may have to divert funds from other essential programs, housing assistance, healthcare initiatives, or public safety to address the surge in need. This compounds the crisis, creating a cycle of instability that affects everyone, not just SNAP recipients. What states can actually do next? Funding challenges and political pressure. As the possibility of a federal funding cutoff grows more likely, states now face an urgent and incredibly difficult question. Can they afford to temporarily fund SNAP on their own? This is not simply a policy debate. It is a financial emergency with multi-billion-dollar implications. SNAP is one of the most expensive benefit programs in the United States, and funding even a single month requires an enormous amount of money that most states simply do not have in their budgets. To put it into perspective, a large state like California or New York may need over $1 billion per month to cover SNAP benefits for all eligible recipients. Even mid-sized states would need hundreds of millions, while smaller states would still face tens of millions in immediate expenses. Very few states have the reserves or legislative flexibility to redirect that amount of funding with little notice. Some states do maintain rainy day funds, but those reserves are designed for emergencies like natural disasters, economic downturns, or infrastructure failures, not to replace federal programs indefinitely. Legislatures would need to vote on allocating funds, an often slow and politically contentious process. And even if funding were approved, states would have to determine how long they could sustain the program before draining their reserves completely. Politically, the pressure is immense. Governors who choose to pay for SNAP temporarily may face criticism for using state tax dollars to cover what many view as a federal responsibility. On the other hand, governors who refuse to cover the shortfall risk facing public outrage as millions go hungry, families lose benefits, and local communities experience immediate hardship. State lawmakers are also grappling with the uncertainty of how long the standoff with the USDA might last. If they believe the dispute will resolve quickly, temporary funding might seem possible, but if they expect prolonged legal battles, they may hesitate to commit billions of dollars with no end in sight. The political stakes rise even higher in states preparing for upcoming elections, where handling or mishandling SNAP funding could significantly impact public opinion. Some states have hinted at seeking emergency loans, short-term borrowing, or rapid budget reallocations to keep SNAP afloat temporarily. But such actions would likely come with long-term financial consequences, including increased debt, reduced investment in other essential programs, and potential credit rating impacts. A few leaders in non-compliant states have publicly stated that they will instead fight the USDA ruling in court rather than provide the data or fund SNAP out of their own budgets. Others appear to be reconsidering their refusal, exploring whether they can meet the federal requirements before funding is officially suspended. In the midst of all these decisions, millions of households are watching closely, unsure of what will happen next. For them, state-level political debates do little to ease the anxiety of not knowing whether they will be able to buy groceries next month. This growing tension is placing both governors and legislatures under extraordinary public pressure to act quickly, faster than bureaucratic systems are typically capable of moving. The next few days and weeks will determine whether states comply, resist, or attempt temporary funding solutions, and whichever path they choose will shape not only the survival of households, but also the political landscape surrounding SNAP for years to come. What comes next? The critical outlook for SNAP and millions of American households. As we reach the end of this developing story, one thing becomes clear. The future of SNAP over the next several weeks is filled with uncertainty, urgency, and potentially historic changes. The decisions made by federal officials, state governments, and the courts will determine whether millions of American families continue receiving essential food assistance or face sudden severe hardship at the start of the new year. For most households relying on SNAP, the situation feels deeply unsettling. They are watching the news, monitoring updates, and checking their EBT accounts with growing anxiety. For seniors living alone, single parents working multiple jobs, disabled individuals with limited mobility, and veterans rebuilding their lives, SNAP is not optional. It is foundational to their well-being. A disruption of even 1 month could create spirals of financial stress that are hard to recover from. Moving forward, the single most important factor will be whether the non-compliant states choose to submit the required data. If they comply, funding could resume smoothly and benefits may continue without interruption. But if even a handful of states maintain their refusal, the USDA has been clear: federal SNAP funds will not be released to those states. This is not a symbolic threat. It is a concrete policy decision already set in motion. Legal challenges may offer temporary relief, but they come with no guarantees. Courts may rule that the federal government acted within its authority, especially given the billions of taxpayer dollars involved. If that happens, the states would have no choice but to comply or pay the cost themselves. The speed at which courts respond will also matter greatly, as delayed rulings could still lead to missed payments during the waiting period. Another key question is how long the federal government intends to maintain this hardline stance. If the USDA remains firm and insists on full compliance, we may see a fundamental restructuring of how SNAP data is collected and monitored nationwide. This could set the stage for stricter eligibility oversight, more robust audits, and increased scrutiny of how states administer benefits. At the same time, millions of Americans are likely to become more politically vocal about SNAP. Public pressure has historically influenced lawmakers when essential programs are at risk, and this time may be no different. Constituents may demand emergency action, pressuring governors and state legislatures to either cooperate with federal authorities or find temporary funding solutions to avoid mass food insecurity. Community organizations, church groups, and food banks will also play a key role in the months ahead. These groups often serve as the first line of defense when families lose public assistance. However, they are already stretched thin, and their ability to absorb sudden surges in need is limited. Their response will help shape how local communities weather any temporary or prolonged gaps in SNAP coverage. On a national level, this conflict may spark renewed debate about the purpose and structure of SNAP itself. Should it remain primarily a federally controlled program? Should states have more flexibility or less? What level of oversight is necessary to prevent fraud without harming innocent families? These questions will likely be discussed in Congress, across news outlets, and in households nationwide. But for right now, the most important thing is awareness and preparation. Families should stay informed, monitor official announcements from their state SNAP offices, and begin planning for the possibility of delays or interruptions. Community leaders and social service workers should be ready to guide individuals toward available resources if federal funding is paused. As we receive more updates, clarity will emerge. But at this moment, the situation is a delicate balance between compliance, legal action, political will, and administrative capability. The coming weeks will determine whether this crisis becomes a brief scare or a major national disruption. What is certain is that millions of Americans are depending on timely decisions from their leaders, decisions that will determine their ability to feed their families, maintain stability, and move forward with dignity. Thank you for joining this detailed breakdown. Staying informed is the best way to stay prepared during uncertain times. As new information becomes available, updates will follow.